record these lessons, but so long as you don't step in front of my computer, you're all good. Just me. Alright, today we're going to be talking about sentence variance. I know this sounds boring, but it's actually really important to how your novel sounds. If you have a bunch of sentences that are all long or all short, it feels weird. You may have never noticed this before because you may not have run into this. Most professionally published books don't have this problem. But if you read anyone else's work, like your friends or your cousins or some random person who's like, hey, read my stuff in English class, you may notice that sometimes the writing feels off. The flow feels off. And if the flow feels off, it may be due to sentence length. If they all have similarly long sentences or similarly worded sentences, it can feel kind of stagnant and boring. So even though this may seem like a boring topic, I promise it makes your writing better. Whether or not you believe me is another question. But before we officially start, I do want to reiterate we still have the contest going on. Currently it's the spring writing contest. We have a teen and adult division, and the entries are due by the end of May. So please feel free to look into that. I am currently looking into possibly doing an end of year kind of like grand prize / raffle. So potentially look into that. You will get a prize irregardless if you participate, but I'm hoping to do something even cooler at the end of the year, budget willing. Anyway, let's continue forward. I'm used to stepping this direction to graduate. Bear with me while I figure out how to rework with the different room. Alright, so the reason sentence length / variance is important is because it helps immerse the reader into your work. As I was saying before, with shorter sentences, it can sometimes feel a little stagnant and almost feel a little too choppy. With super, super long sentences all the time, sometimes it can feel start to get really, almost have a lullaby-like quality, which is, if that's what you're going for, fantastic. But if that's not what you're going for, you can lull your reader to sleep. And that's not good. So this is why it's important to have some variance. We're going to first talk about the benefit of shorter sentences. Alright, so shorter sentences, as I said, they can pack a real punch, but that can also make it feel really choppy if all your sentences are super short, which is why it's nice to have a little bit of both. With shorter sentences, it helps give an emphasis and an intensity. It can also help increase if the character is scared or has anxiety. It can very much amp that up because when we read shorter sentences, the automatic thing, if we're reading it out loud and even in our head, is we're reading the sentence and then it stops. We're reading the sentence and then it stops. And generally, people take a breath when they finish the end of a sentence. Most of the time, it's kind of what we've been taught since grade school, right? And with that, that means if you have a ton of short sentences, you're also taking a lot more breaths, which is mimicking very much an intense or anxiety-provoking situation because you breathe harder when you're anxious or scared, right? It can also help with action scenes due to the fact that it can lend itself, like I said, to having that intensity, to having that moment where they're just like breathing super hard and everything's super fast and quick and awesome. The quickness and fastness of your sentences will also help the quickness and fastness and pace of your story. Keeping that in mind, with pacing your story, you gotta have variance pacing because if it's all quick, then it goes too quick. If it's all slow, then it's too slow. Which is why it's nice to have a little bit of both. It can also help with shorter sentences to increase the poeticism. A great example of this is if you're talking about someone's heart beating, and then you have, or if you're talking about someone being really frustrated, you can say, I got so frustrated every period, single period, time period. That feels very poetic. Technically, grammatically, that's not accurate. But hey, grammar rules can go in the dumpster fire just so long as you're doing it for a reason. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It can feel very poetic to have the emphasis on every single word. Just make sure you're not doing it for a super long sentence. If you're doing it for like a sentence that I would say is more than 8 words, it loses its meaning. That's when it tends to get a little drug out and it starts to feel weird. However, if you have a sentence that's 8 words or fewer, I would say 100% that's a great way to pack a punch with those words. The only reason why it loses its poeticism as it goes on is the same reason why italics lose their emphasis if you see too many. If you see them like italicizing every other word, you're gonna go, whoa, and it's gonna feel weird, right? Same thing with if they're using periods to emphasize the sentence every other word. That's gonna feel weird. But if you're doing it every once in a while to add emphasis and impact of the words to really pack that punch, that is gonna help you to be able to utilize that in a much more interesting way. All right. Of course, if we talk about shorter sentences, we're now going to talk about longer sentences and their benefits. Now, this is something that you may not really think of when you're writing, and in that case, don't worry about it. I'm going to just get on a soapbox here real quick. With sentence variance, just write what you want to write to your heart's content in the first draft. This is more second draft material. This is more, hey, I got the first draft done. Now I'm going to look back and say, oh, this sentence might be better if it was, a little bit more shorter. Or this sentence might be better if it was a little more drawn out and long. So this is definitely much more second draft type material. But because of the fact that we have so many short story contests, I feel that this is a great opportunity to practice within the short story contest. So on it, and I would love to see you all enter. I honestly love getting to read all the entries. It makes me happy. It makes me happy to see people enter into the contest. Anyway, so with longer sentences, the reason you may want to make a sentence longer or more lengthy is because, as I was saying before, it almost has an elegant lullaby type quality to it, which is very nice. It feels very good. It's also very reminiscent of classical literature, so if you're trying to do anything kind of Regency romance or anything that's kind of meant to be in a more historical time period, having longer sentences could actually be very beneficial because it would help be more immersive in that time period. Shorter sentence structure is actually a much more modern thing. Did it happen in the past? Yes. But it was not common. Long, flowy, lengthy, super poetic sentences were much more common in classical literature than they are today. They are also more relaxing and, as I said before, elegant. That's probably why they were used a lot more in historical literature, because they weren't trying to write action-packed thrillers. They were trying to write, and Miss Daisy is desperately in love with Lord so-and-so, which needs more elegant writing, right? It needs to be a little more fanciful, like a ball gown. And so having more long sentences made sense for that structure style. That may be why when you read classical literature, you're feeling like, whoa, why is it so long and descriptive? Because the whole style and the whole point of the style is to be long and elegant and pretty. It's not meant to get to the point and pack a punch. If you're used to that was honestly the biggest thing with me when I was younger. I didn't understand that when I was first reading classical literature, so I was like, whoa, why did I go from these super cool action-packed fantasy novels to these things where I'm like, this sentence is so long. And hey, long sentences, like I said, they can be used well, and they can be good, and they can be positive, impactfully on the story. But they were often used a little too much in classical literature because that's all they were told. They were told you always follow grammar rules, and you always have long, pretty sentences. You don't always need long, pretty sentences, and you don't always need to follow grammar rules, contrary to anything your English teachers might say. But they're wrong. The reason they're wrong is because of creative writing. And some people may disagree with this, but I personally firmly believe, and have seen this many times in professionally published literature, that it's not so much about grammar as it is about getting your point across to the reader. If your point is getting super muddled because you have 1,000 different weird punctuations and 1,000 different weird things that you're doing with accents and this and that, then that can be hindering to the reader, and that's a problem. But if it's not a problem, if it helps it flow better, that's totally fine. Granted, you may just want to default to grammar until getting out of school, because unfortunately most school teachers are like, grammar is king, and it is not, but that's okay. It's funny because they'll always say like, well, in professionally published literature, and I'm like, actually, in professionally published literature that isn't a classic, they break grammar rules all the time. Moving forward though. With longer sentences, another thing that you also might notice, which is also very reminiscent of classic literature, is what's called tactful telling. Now, just a recap for those of you who have either not listened to the other videos or those of you who are new. With tactful telling, the difference between tactful telling and showing is the amount of showing that is done. So showing is, for example, he swung his sword, blonde hair shining in the moonlight. That's showing. You're not saying he is blonde and he is wielding a sword. That would be telling. So one is telling, one is showing. Tactful telling would be something like, his blonde hair shone in the moonlight. Though he was anxious and feeling nervous, the way he flourished his sword would not indicate as such. You're telling us he's anxious and nervous instead of showing us he's anxious and nervous, but you're also doing a fair amount of showing to help balance out the amount of telling that you're doing. That makes it so it's more tactful, and so it feels more well done and appropriate. If you just do telling, it feels boring. If you just do showing, that's totally fine. But some people like a mix of both. Showing or tactful telling, I would say, are both equally fair ways to write and are both fantastic writing styles. Telling solely is the only real issue, and that's mainly just because that's really what they do in textbooks and children's books. So if you're writing a children's book, that's totally fine. Tell all you want. But if you're writing anything that is middle grade or above, you're probably going to want to do more showing. Alright, moving right along forward. Now we're going to talk about mid-range sentences. You know, the kind of Goldilocks sentence. They're not super, super long, but they're also not super short. Just your average sentence. This is nice to convey basic information. If this is information that is necessary for the reader to know, but not super impactful for the reader, a good, solid mid-range sentence is nice. It's actually less distracting. If you want to put more emphasis on something, like for example, you're doing a big, long, elegant description, having it be big and long is going to put more emphasis on that description. And it's going to make us go, huh, interesting. Why is this so important? You're spending a lot of time talking about this, so it must be important. And shorter sentences are going to, like I said, pack a punch. So as a result of that, they're again going to go, huh, wonder why that sentence is so short. Maybe it's because of this and this and that emotional things. Whereas a mid-range sentence, it just kind of gets you from point A, emotional thing, to point B, important emotional thing. These are the sentences that are honestly kind of the most important. It's almost like a cook in a kitchen. You know, you can have as many servers and waitresses as you want, but ultimately, you can have all of them, and if none of them know how to cook, it's useless. So, the mid-range sentences are like the cooks in the kitchen. They get us from point A to point B. The servers are going to help, you know, give presentation, and they're going to help give good customer service, you know, all those other important things. But without the food, you can't do anything else. Mid-range sentences are very much the nice, good fluff in the sandwich. As far as that goes, I would say generally your sentence is going to be filled with majority mid-range sentences, some longer sentences, and some shorter sentences. Unless, again, you're trying to mimic a certain style, like classic literature, in which case it might be entirely almost long sentences with a couple mid-range sentences. So it does depend. There are a lot of variant factors. All right. Next, we're going to talk about grammar, because we're talking about sentence variance, not just your everyday long and short sentences. All right, so sentence length is super important, but we're also going to talk about grammar. The reason why is because, as I said, you may have had drilled into you, and you probably will. You will probably leave today and still have your teacher hammering into your head, grammar, grammar, grammar. And, well, when it comes to creative writing, it can get a lot more loosey-goosey, and that's totally fine. The one thing I would say, though, with grammatical sentences is make sure you know what's correct first before you break it. If you break it intentionally, that's powerful. If you're breaking it accidentally, that's actually just kind of frustrating for the reader. And it's not as stylistic. But if you know, hey, when I add a comma here, for example, a comma splice. A comma splice is when you have two sentences that have been combined into one sentence via a comma. Or, alternatively, you have one sentence that is just fine as one sentence, and you put a comma in there for no reason. Those are both comma splices. With said comma splice, it's important to note that if you have two long sentences that two sentences that are being joined by a comma, you can consider possibly using a semicolon instead. I would highly recommend the semicolon if you're really not feeling using a period. But if you want to use that comma, just consider why. Why does the comma need to be there? Why do you feel that a slight pause, but not a semicolon level pause, but not a full stop of a period needs to be there? This again is all second draft stuff. If you're writing your first draft, don't worry about it, unless you want to, in which case please feel free. Some people like worrying about this kind of stuff when they're writing because it gives them something to focus on. Another great example of grammatically incorrect things that can be fun is dependent clauses. Sorry, I'm tired. With independent and dependent clauses, independent obviously can stand on their own, dependent cannot. However, I've seen several traditionally published and independently published, hence why I say professionally published, because some independently published and traditionally published novels are a little bit rough. But with professionally published novels, I have seen many who are utilizing, to great effect, dependent clauses. And the reason why is because, like I said, sometimes that shorter sentence for packing punch of emphasis can really mean something. And especially with a dependent clause, it doesn't always have to be a full sentence that stands on its own. It can sometimes be more powerful and more impactful to be kind of a dangling sentence. With these cases, just keep in mind, like I said, if someone says, hey, this is a dependent clause, or hey, you have a comma splice here, or whatever the grammar problem is. There's so many. Those are just good examples. Just make sure that when you reread over it, you say, hey, this is why. You don't just say, it's fine. Say, okay, let's look at that. Would it be better if I changed it? Look at it genuinely and say, hey, if I changed it, how would that change the line? Maybe even read it out loud and see how it changes based on how you punctuate it. I know that there are lots of times where I've, as a professional editor, have changed hyphens to comma because it worked better and flowed better with a comma. But some people really love their hyphens, and if you want a hyphen, go for it. It's not necessarily about that, it's about how it flows on the page. Feel free to read your dependent clauses aloud, read your comma splices aloud, and see how they feel. If they feel good and you feel like that is what you were trying to get across, keep it. By all means, keep it. But if you're feeling like, maybe that wasn't what I was trying to go for, maybe it would be better, being two sentences or being an independent clause, then change it. Honestly, it's more about what you feel your book needs. That being said, unfortunately, some people will be very stubborn with these kinds of things, so I wish you luck. Hope that whatever publishers you find in the future are not that stubborn. Granted, as I said, there are lots of professionally published novels that are totally fine with breaking a few grammar rules here and there. So, there are good ones out there. Just need to find them. Alright. Last thing that we're going to talk about today is doing accents. I'm going to do kind of a cheesy thing here. To be or not to be with accents. Because with accents, it can really enhance a character to have them have, a really fun accent, kind of, spell things funny, or like, do the classic the classic stereotypical cheesy French accent, where it's like, that is the question. You know, you can do that where you add Z's and stuff like that to try and make it sound like they're speaking in French, but with French accent in English. Or you can try to make it sound like, you know, they're from some, you know, redneck hick town. You can add some fun things to do fun accents in your novel, and that's absolutely encouraged. It can be so much fun for characterization to have some wild characters. I know as a writer as well as a dungeon master, I absolutely have so much fun doing accents and character voices. However, the reason you shouldn't do an accent is, A, if it's offensive and not actually accurate. Obviously that's not nice. However, if it is decently accurate, or if it does add more color and flavor to your story, absolutely do it. One time I would definitely say do accents is if they actually do have an accent. Just saying they have a French accent is going to throw readers off so bad. Because let me tell you, if you're not already doing it in an accent, and then you just say halfway through the book, by the way, they're French, they're going to go, what? And just gasp at you, kind of confused. And you don't want your reader to do that. Anything that pulls your reader out of the story and makes them go, huh, in a bad way is not good. Now, granted, you can go, huh, in a good way, and like, my mind is blown because plot twist, but that's a different kind of huh. We're talking about the huh that's like, why though? I'm confused. So I would say if you're going to do an accent, A, do your research. Make sure you do it appropriately, correctly, and that it's not offensive. B, I would also say make sure you do the accent from the beginning. C, if they are from a specific country that is now going to a different country and they're speaking English, make sure to do an accent, because just saying they have an accent is going to mess with the reader so bad. I was reading something the other day where they were like, oh yeah, by the way, they're like, have a German accent. And I was like, I have not been imagining them with a German accent this entire book. This is a problem. And I had to go back and be like, okay, either figure out how to do a German accent or mention it on page 1 when they're first introduced. So I will say, if you don't want to do an accent and you don't feel comfortable doing an accent, don't. But what you have to do is you have to mention it in the first couple sentences within introducing the character. If you mention it any later than that, you're going to throw your readers off and pull them out of the story. That's not fun for your readers or for you. So if you're gonna avoid an accent but still want that as part of the character, mention it within the first couple sentences of introduction, whenever you introduce them. All right. That is all for today with our little 30-minute lesson. Do you guys have any questions regarding sentence variety? I'll give you like 1 minute to think of questions, and then if not, I'll just turn off the video and we can free reign. Does that have a question?
Yeah, how do you do like an accent without it being like hard to read?
Excellent question. Honestly, it depends on the accent, I think, is the only problem there. Some accents are much harder to do than others. I will say one fun thing that you can do if it is hard to read is do what Brandon Sanderson did, where he had a character with a super thick accent, and he actually had several of the other characters go, I have no idea what he's saying. And so as a result, the reader feels like, oh, phew, it's not just me who can't read this. So if you do have an accent that's just naturally hard to read, I would say definitely do something like that, where you have a comedic moment where the characters and the readers are like, we're on the same page, we're okay, you know, I'm not crazy, this is hard. So I'd say do that if you're going to do something wild. Generally, I would say if you do your research, there are so many different ways to do accents in a way that is clear, concise, and easy to read. So I would say, depending on the accent, do your research and see if someone else has done it in a way that you like and that you feel is easily readable. Unfortunately, since there's all different accents, I can't just give you a basic answer, but I would say for each accent, do your research and see what you can do. I would also see if you can find any movies or TV shows with people with that accent, because the more you listen to it, the more you can come up with good ways to write it. Or at least I found a lot of that works for me and other writers that I know. So if you were like, hey, I want to do a German accent, find a TV show or movie that has a really good German accent. If you want to do a British accent, find pretty much any Regency romance TV show, and you will be able to figure out how to write that appropriately. But yeah, great question. Loved that. Any other questions? Good? Okay, cool. I will turn the video off then. Let's see.